"Mhm. The house is too small, Mom. You know how it is. Just spend Christmas at home this year. We'll come by and see you after." That was what my son said to me. Not with cruelty in his voice. That was almost worse. He said it the way you tell someone the restaurant was fully booked. Casual, apologetic on the surface, final underneath. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone with both hands, the way I've held things my whole life, carefully, like they might break. Outside the window, the first snow of December was coming down over Millbrook, soft and quiet and indifferent to everything. "Okay," I said. Just that. Okay. I don't know why I said it. Maybe because I'd been saying okay to Daniel for 40 years and the word came out before I could stop it. Maybe because some part of me still believed he'd call back, that he'd think about it on the drive home, look over at his wife and say, "We should have Mom come." That Miranda would nod and say, "Of course we should." He didn't call back. "My name is Margaret, and I am 67 years old. And I want to tell you something that took me most of my life to understand. You cannot love someone into treating you well. You can only love them and then decide, again and again every single morning, what you are willing to accept in return." I grew up in a small house in western Pennsylvania, the oldest of 4. My mother worked the early shift at the diner on Route 9, and my father drove trucks 3 weeks out of every month. I learned early that love was something you demonstrated through action. You showed up. You stayed late. You gave what you had, even when what you had wasn't much. I carried that into my marriage, into motherhood, into every relationship I've ever had. For 31 years, I was a pediatric nurse at Millbrook Regional. I held other people's children during the worst moments of their lives. I learned to stay calm when everything around me was falling apart. I learned that the body can endure extraordinary things when the mind decides it must. I raised Daniel alone for most of it. His father, Robert, left when Daniel was 9, not dramatically. Robert wasn't a dramatic man. He just stopped coming home one evening, and eventually I stopped expecting him to. We divorced quietly, the way we'd done most things, without much noise. Daniel was a good boy. I want to be clear about that, because what I'm about to tell you is not the story of a child who was born without a conscience. He was kind when he was small. He used to save his Halloween candy and bring it to the older woman next door, Mrs. Rain Peterson, because she lived alone and he said she looked lonely. He was 10 years old. I thought I had done something right. I worked double shifts to keep us in our house on Birchwood Lane. I paid for his baseball camps every summer, even the summers when I ate peanut butter sandwiches 4 nights a week, so the numbers would work. When he got into Clemson, I sold my mother's jewelry, not all of it, just the pieces I told myself I could live without, to cover the gap between his scholarship and the tuition bill. I never told him that. I should have. That's something I understand now that I didn't then. I thought protecting him from the weight of sacrifice was the loving thing. I thought if he didn't know the cost, he could move through his life lightly, freely, without guilt. I was wrong. What I actually did was teach him that things arrived without cost. That support was air, invisible, ever-present, and requiring nothing in return. He graduated and moved to Charlotte. Got a good job in finance. I was so proud I cried in the parking lot of the venue after his graduation ceremony, alone in my car, windows fogged up, ugly crying the way you only let yourself do when no one can see. He met Miranda 2 years later. She was beautiful and sharp and came from a family with a beach house in Hilton Head and opinions about everything. I told myself I liked her. Some days I even believed it. They got married in October, 3 years ago now. A big wedding, 200 people at a vineyard outside of Charlotte. I wore the blue dress I'd bought 2 months earlier, and alterations that cost me $40 I didn't mention to anyone. I sat at a table with Daniel's college friends and their wives. Nice people. People who didn't know my name by the end of the night. I danced with my son once, briefly, because Miranda's mother needed him for photos. I drove home that Sunday and told myself it was a beautiful wedding and that I was grateful. I made tea and sat at my kitchen table and looked at the photos on my refrigerator. Daniel at 6, gap-toothed and grinning, holding a fish he'd caught at the lake in Ohio. Daniel at 16, in his baseball uniform, squinting into the sun. I thought, we have time. This is just the beginning of their life together. Things will settle. He will find his footing and he will come back to me. I waited. The first Christmas after the wedding, Miranda's family hosted everyone in Hilton Head. I understood. New family, new traditions, first year. Daniel called on Christmas morning and we talked for 11 minutes. I counted after, not because I'm the kind of person who counts those things. I didn't used to be, but because 11 minutes felt like something I needed to hold on to and measure. I cooked a small ham for myself and watched television and fell asleep before midnight. The second Christmas, Daniel and Miranda hosted at their house in Charlotte. It was their first year in the new house, the house I'd helped them buy. I want to explain that carefully. When they were looking, they found a house they loved but were short on the down payment. Daniel called me and explained the situation the way you explain a math problem. The gap was $18,000. I had $22,000 in savings. It was everything I had put aside since Robert left. Everything I had skimmed from grocery budgets and vacation funds and the retirement contributions I'd reduced when the hospital cut our benefits. I had been building that number for 14 years. I wired them the money on a Thursday. I did not expect to be repaid. I want to say that plainly. I gave it because he needed it and I had it, and he was my son. I'm not telling you this so you'll think badly of him for not repaying me. I'm telling you this because of what happened that second Christmas. I drove 4 hours to Charlotte. I brought a pecan pie and a sweet potato casserole and a gift for Miranda. A cashmere scarf in the pale green I'd seen her admire once in a magazine she'd left at my house. I wrapped it myself with the good ribbon. Dinner was Miranda's family, her parents and sister and brother-in-law and their children, 8 people plus Daniel and Miranda. And me. I sat at the far end of the table and passed dishes and refilled things and smiled at the right moments. After dinner, Miranda's mother and I did the dishes together. She was perfectly pleasant. She told me about their trip to Portugal. I listened. I told her the casserole recipe when she asked. Daniel hugged me at the door when I left and said, "Thanks for making the drive, Mom. It means a lot." I said okay. I drove 4 hours home in the dark. I don't know exactly when I started to understand what was happening. It wasn't a single moment. It was more like the way you notice a room getting cold. Not the exact second the heat went off, but a gradual awareness that your hands are stiff and your breath is showing and you've been sitting in the cold for a while without admitting it. The calls got shorter. The visits got less frequent. When I called, it went to voicemail more than not. When I texted, I got back brief responses that answered the surface of what I'd said and nothing underneath. How are you? Good, busy. How's work? Fine, crazy. How's Miranda? She's great. I stopped mentioning that I missed him because the one time I had, he'd said, "Mom, I know, but we're just really slammed right now." And I'd felt ashamed for saying it. You learn not to say things that make you feel ashamed. I kept sending birthday cards with checks inside. I kept asking his shoe size every Christmas because it changed in my head and I was always afraid to guess wrong. I kept making the pecan pie because he'd loved it since he was 12. And I kept telling myself that this was just what happened when your children grew up, that I was lucky he had a full life, that I was being needy, that my own mother had said when I was young that the best thing you can do for your children is teach them to leave you and that I should be proud. I was 64 years old, and I was working to convince myself that being invisible was success. Last December, I called Daniel in the first week of the month. I do that. I plan ahead, I give notice, I don't surprise people. I asked about Christmas. There was a small pause. "So, here's the thing," he said. I have come to believe that no sentence that begins with "here's the thing" has ever ended well. He explained that Miranda's parents were flying in, that the house would be full, that the guest room was being used for Miranda's sister's baby. He said it would be a lot of people in a small space and he didn't want me to be uncomfortable. He was protecting me from discomfort. That was how he framed it. "We'll come by and see you after," he said. "Maybe the 26th. We'll come for a few hours, have leftovers. It'll be good." The 26th. I stood in my kitchen and looked at the window, and outside the snow was falling, and I thought about $18,000 and pecan pies, and $40 dress alterations, and 11-minute phone calls, and the fish in the photo on my refrigerator. "Okay," I said. I hung up and I sat down at my kitchen table, and I put my hands flat on the surface, and I sat there for a long time without moving. This is the thing about grief that nobody explains properly. It isn't always loud. Sometimes it is the quietest thing in the world. Sometimes it looks exactly like a 67-year-old woman sitting alone at her kitchen table in December with her hands flat on the wood and the snow coming down outside and absolutely nothing moving. I sat there and I thought about my mother's jewelry. I thought about the peanut butter sandwiches. I thought about the dresses I didn't buy and the vacations I didn't take and the retirement contributions I reduced. And I thought about the number 18,000. And I thought about my son's voice on the phone, explaining to me carefully that his house was too small for me this Christmas. And then something shifted. I don't know how to describe it, except to say that it was like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known was there, not anger. I want to be precise about this, because what happened next was not about anger. It was more like clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you've been standing in fog for so long that you've stopped noticing it's fog, and then the wind comes and you can suddenly see the actual shape of things. I saw the actual shape of things. I got up from the table and I made myself a cup of tea and I sat back down and I thought very carefully about my life. I have a friend named Carol, who I've known since we worked together on the pediatric floor in 1989. Carol is 71, and she's the kind of person who says the true thing even when it's uncomfortable. She came over that evening because I called her, and she could hear something in my voice, and she showed up 40 minutes later with wine and the particular expression she gets when she's ready to be honest. I told her everything. The phone call, the house too small, the 26, the 18,000, all of it. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "Margaret, how long have you been making yourself smaller so he'd have more room?" I didn't answer. She said, "You sold your mother's jewelry. He didn't know about that." "That's not better," she said. "That's actually worse. You gave him everything and you didn't even let him know the cost, so he never learned there was one." I wanted to argue with her. I've noticed that we most want to argue with the things we already know are true. "What do?" I said. Carol looked at me steadily. She said, "You stop. I want to be careful here because what I did next was not dramatic. There were no speeches. There were no confrontations. I did not call Daniel and tell him what I thought of his Christmas logistics. I am 67 years old and I have worked too hard and come too far to spend my energy on scenes. What I did was quiet. What I did was mine. I called my attorney in January, a woman named Patricia who I'd used for my will and a property matter years ago, and I made an appointment. I updated my will. I changed the primary beneficiary from Daniel to 3 organizations: a pediatric care foundation, a women's shelter 2 towns over that had been trying to expand their transitional housing, and a college scholarship fund for first-generation nursing students at Millbrook Regional, where I'd spent my career. I did not tell Daniel. I also stopped sending the monthly checks I had been sending without announcement for the past 2 years. $200 a month just transferred quietly into his account. Because I'd known they were managing a big mortgage and I told myself it was nothing, I could spare it. I stopped. I did not tell him. I joined a watercolor class at the community center on Tuesday evenings. I had always meant to paint. Robert had made a remark once, early in our marriage, that creative hobbies were impractical, and I had agreed with him, and then I had spent the next 30 years agreeing with various versions of that same remark made by various people. I was done agreeing with it. I went to Carol's for Christmas Eve. Her daughter and son-in-law were there and her 2 grandchildren, and they were loud and messy and nobody was performing anything for anyone. I ate too much and stayed too late and drove home through the dark streets of Millbrook and sat in my driveway for a moment before going in. I thought, this is what it feels like to be somewhere you are actually wanted. Daniel and Miranda came on the 27th, not the 26th as promised. He texted the evening of the 26th. Hey mom, crazy day. Can we do tomorrow instead? I said, of course. That's the reflex. Of course. They came for 2 hours. Miranda was pleasant. Daniel was warm in the way he'd learned to be warm, present enough to not feel guilty, not present enough to be inconvenient. He ate the pecan pie and said it was amazing, same as always. When they were leaving, he hugged me at the door and said, "You seem different." I said, "Do I?" He looked at me a moment. "Good different," he said, uncertain. I smiled. I said I was glad they'd come. I closed the door and stood in my hallway in the quiet, and I thought, I am different, and I am not doing this for you to notice. In February, I got a call from Daniel. Not voicemail, not a text, a real call. And when I answered, he sounded like something was wrong. He said there had been a miscommunication about the automatic transfers. He'd gotten a statement and noticed they'd stopped. He said it carefully, working around the edges of what he was actually asking. I said, yes, I stopped those. Silence. Oh, he said, okay, is everything all right? Everything is fine, I said. I just needed the money for other things. I could hear him trying to figure out what to say. He asked if I was having financial trouble. I told him I wasn't. He asked if something had happened. I said no. There was a long pause. Mom, he said finally. Can I ask, are you upset with me about Christmas? And here is what I want to tell you. Because this is the moment I'd been preparing for in my own quiet way for 2 months. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not give him a list of every sacrifice or produce evidence like a prosecutor. I said, Daniel, I've been thinking a lot about our relationship, and I think I've spent a long time making myself available in ways that weren't always healthy for either of us. I love you. I'm always going to love you. But I think I'm going to start spending my time and my resources a little differently from now on. He was quiet. I waited. He said, I don't really understand what that means. I said, I think you will in time. He said he wanted to talk about it more. I said there wasn't much more to say, but that I hoped we'd see each other soon and that I was glad he called. We said goodbye. I stood at the window and watched the last of the winter light go down behind the trees on Birchwood Lane. Then I went and got my watercolors and sat at the kitchen table and worked on the piece I'd been painting for 2 weeks, a view of the lake in Ohio, from memory. The one in my son's photo on the refrigerator. The two of us, summer, a fish that had seemed enormous to a 6-year-old. I painted it carefully, the light on the water, the reeds at the edge, the small shape of a boy squinting into the sun. I painted it for myself. People ask me, or I imagine they would ask me, if I could speak plainly to them, whether I regret it, whether I regret closing off, whether I think I should have tried harder, talked more, explained more, given him the chance to respond differently. I want to answer that honestly. I don't regret the love. I never will. I gave it freely and I'd give it again, but I'd give it differently. I'd give it with more honesty about what it cost. I'd say, I sold my mother's jewelry for this, and I need you to know that. I'd say, I am skipping my own needs for yours right now, and that matters. I'd say, love is not a transaction, but it is a relationship, and relationship require 2 people who can see each other. I regret the silence, not my silence now, the silence I kept for decades. The okays I said when I meant something much harder and more important. The times I made myself smaller and called it love when what it actually was fear. Fear that if I asked for too much, he'd have less. Fear that need was the same as burden. He called again in March. We talked for a while, longer than we had in years. He said he'd been thinking. He said Miranda had noticed I seemed different at Christmas, and he'd been sitting with that. He said, and I could hear that it cost him something to say it, "I think I've taken you for granted, Mom." I didn't say it was okay. That word has caused me enough trouble. I said, "I think we can do better. Both of us." He said he'd like to try. I said I'd like that too. I don't know what happens next. I'm not going to tell you we fixed everything, because we haven't. Trust is not rebuilt in a phone call or even in a season. There is still work ahead, real work. The kind that requires both people to show up honestly and stay in the discomfort until something new grows. But I am not waiting at any bus stop. I am not sitting by the phone. I am not making myself invisible in my own life and calling it generosity. On Tuesday evenings, I go to my watercolor class. On Saturdays, I have coffee with Carol. I am learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to take up exactly as much space as I deserve, which is the same amount as everyone else, no more and no less. My name is Margaret. I am 67 years old, and I am still here.